You won't believe what happened to me when I thought my life was stuck in a dead end. I was just an ordinary young man trying to survive each day, paying bills late, working shifts that drained every ounce of energy, and living in a tiny apartment that creaked with every step. I never expected that my world would be turned upside down because of one shocking revelation. If you're hearing this story, I want you to listen closely because it might change the way you think about fate, family, and hidden legacies. And before I dive in, make sure to subscribe, because stories like this are not only rare, but they remind us that life has a way of surprising us when we least expect it. Now, picture this: I was sitting in my dimly lit room, scrolling through endless job postings on a cracked laptop, when my phone buzzed with a message I almost ignored. It was from a law firm I didn't recognize, written in such a formal tone that I thought it was a scam. The message said they needed to urgently meet with me regarding the estate of Mr. Lawrence H. Whitmore. My heart skipped because that was my grandfather's name. The thing is, I barely knew him. He was this towering figure in our family, ruthlessly wealthy, known for his billion-dollar empire, but also distant, cold, and unreachable. He had cut himself off from most of us years ago, and my father never spoke much about him. I assumed I was nothing more than a forgotten grandchild to him. So why would a law firm be contacting me? I remember sitting there, the glow of the laptop screen on my face, thinking it had to be some kind of elaborate trick. But something in my gut told me I couldn't ignore it. The next morning, curiosity dragged me into their downtown office, a place so polished and intimidating that I felt out of place just stepping inside. Floor-to-ceiling glass, expensive art on the walls, and men in tailored suits who barely glanced at me as I walked past. They led me into a conference room where 3 lawyers were waiting with folders stacked high on the table. The air felt heavy, like they were about to tell me something that would alter the course of my life. One of them cleared his throat and said, "Mr. Whitmore, we regret to inform you of the passing of your grandfather." I froze. Even though we weren't close, a rush of emotions hit me: confusion, sadness, but mostly disbelief. Then came the part that nearly made me lose my balance. The lawyer adjusted his glasses and continued, "Your grandfather left behind a detailed will, and you are the primary beneficiary of his estate, valued at approximately $5 billion. For a moment, I thought I'd misheard him. $5 billion? That number was so unreal it didn't register. I laughed nervously and said, "You must have the wrong person. I'm nobody." But they insisted it was true. They showed me documents, his signature, legal seals, everything airtight. My hands trembled as I turned the pages, seeing my name written over and over again. I couldn't process it. The man I barely knew had just left me one of the largest fortunes imaginable. I left that office in a daze, walking through the bustling city streets where nobody knew that the kid they just brushed past was now the heir to an empire worth billions. My old life, the stress, the debt, the constant struggle, suddenly collided with a future that felt impossible to even picture. And yet, in that moment, a strange fear crept in too. Because when you inherit something this massive, it doesn't just bring wealth. It brings questions, enemies, and responsibilities that can change everything about who you are and who you thought you'd be. When I walked out of that law office, the city suddenly looked different, as though every skyscraper and every car rushing by knew something I didn't yet understand. The sky was gray, heavy with clouds, but I felt almost blinded by the weight of what I had just heard. My phone buzzed non-stop with missed calls from family members who somehow already knew. News travels fast when money is involved. Cousins I hadn't spoken to in years were suddenly leaving voicemails dripping with fake affection. "Hey, cousin. Just checking in, I heard about Grandpa, let's meet up sometime soon." My uncle, who had always belittled my father for being the black sheep of the Whitmore family, left me a long, trembling message practically begging to talk. It was bizarre, because for most of my life, these people never cared about me. They only saw me as the grandson of a distant billionaire they'd been cut off from. And now, suddenly, I was the center of their universe. I could feel the greed oozing through their words before they even said it. That was the first hint of how dangerous inheriting $5 billion could actually be. It wasn't just about luxury cars, mansions, or private jets, it was about the fact that money this big turns blood into a battlefield. That evening, I went back to my apartment, the one-bedroom shoebox I had been barely holding on to. I sat there on the creaky futon, staring at the peeling wallpaper, and the thought hit me like a wave: I didn't belong here anymore. But at the same time, I wasn't ready to leave. Because what do you do when your entire identity, poor, struggling, invisible, collides with the sudden reality that you now own estates, stocks, businesses, and properties across the globe? The lawyers had given me a packet of documents that listed some of the assets, and I remember flipping through it in disbelief. There was a mansion in New York with chandeliers imported from Italy, an estate in France with vineyards that stretched farther than the eye could see, a collection of rare cars worth more than I could ever dream of earning in a lifetime, and bank accounts stacked with numbers that made my head spin. I thought wealth was supposed to feel like freedom, but what I felt in that moment was a strange kind of suffocation. I was being handed a life I didn't know how to live. The next morning, the law firm arranged a chauffeur to pick me up and take me to the Whitmore estate, the massive mansion where my grandfather had lived his final years. As the black car pulled up to the gates, I felt my stomach knotting. The iron gates were adorned with the Whitmore crest, a family symbol I had only ever seen in pictures. The driveway stretched endlessly, lined with marble statues and fountains so grand they looked like they belonged in a museum. When the car stopped, I stepped out onto the gravel and looked up at the towering mansion. Its windows glared down at me like watchful eyes, and the silence of the place was almost oppressive. Inside, the air smelled faintly of polished wood and old money. Portraits of ancestors stared from the walls, each one painted in exquisite detail, their stern faces carrying that same unmistakable Whitmore pride. I felt like an intruder walking those halls, even though they now technically belonged to me. In the grand study, the lawyers explained the finer details of the inheritance. My grandfather had left specific instructions for me, guidelines, not demands, but strong enough to feel like expectations. He wanted me to oversee the empire, to protect the name, to continue the Whitmore legacy. They handed me sealed letters he had written personally to me, words from a man I had never really known. The first line made my chest tighten: "If you're reading this, it means I trusted you more than the rest." I had to sit down as I read, because the emotions I'd buried about him came rushing back. My grandfather had always seemed cold, even cruel, but in his words I sensed regret, maybe even love, hidden beneath his powerful exterior. He wrote about watching me from a distance, about how he admired my resilience despite having nothing, and how he believed I could succeed where others in the family had failed. For the first time, I felt a connection to him, not as a billionaire titan, but as a man who, in his final days, wanted his legacy to mean something, but not everyone was happy about his decision. That same night, during a private family gathering at the estate, the hostility was undeniable. My uncles, aunts, and cousins gathered in the grand dining hall, each one dressed in their finest, pretending to mourn but barely hiding their anger. When the will was mentioned, I could feel the heat of their stares burning into me. One cousin muttered under his breath, "He doesn't deserve it. He barely knew him." My uncle, red-faced and trembling, slammed his glass on the table and said, "This is a mistake. Lawrence must have been out of his mind. We built this empire, and now it's all in his hands? A nobody?" The room buzzed with tension, and for a moment I thought they might actually throw me out, despite the will's ironclad wording. I stayed silent, gripping the edge of the table, reminding myself to breathe. This wasn't just about me anymore, it was about a battle between bloodlines, jealousy, and the ghost of a man who had chosen me above them all. Walking out of that hall later, I realized something crucial. This inheritance wasn't just a gift. It was a test, one that would drag me into battles I never imagined: legal fights, public scrutiny, betrayal, and even danger. Because when you inherit billions, people don't see you as family anymore. They see you as an obstacle, or worse, a target. And as I stood in the silent corridors of that mansion, staring at the portrait of my grandfather, I whispered a promise: I'll protect it. I'll protect everything you built. Even if I have to fight them all. The following days unfolded like something out of a movie, each moment heavier than the last, because the will had set into motion a chain reaction of greed, suspicion, and desperation among people I once thought I could trust. I realized quickly that my grandfather's wealth was both a blessing and a curse, because it illuminated the true colors of everyone around me. Long-lost relatives started arriving at my doorstep, each armed with fake stories of reconciliation and crocodile tears, while lawyers representing supposed business partners began calling me with veiled threats and fabricated contracts. But the worst of all was the way my own immediate family, people who had once ignored me, treated me like an outsider, and in many ways abandoned me, suddenly began circling like vultures. Cousins who once sneered at me in family gatherings now called me dear cousin with forced affection, and uncles who had dismissed me as a nobody now wanted to help me manage the estate. Their hypocrisy was suffocating. Yet, amidst the chaos, I couldn't help but hear my grandfather's voice in my mind, reminding me that he had trusted me with this legacy not for the wealth itself, but for the responsibility it carried. His words had always been cryptic, but he used to say, "Money is like fire, it can warm your home or burn it down. The choice lies in whose hands it rests." And as I began to understand the intricacies of his estate, real estate holdings that stretched across continents, companies whose shares influenced global markets, and philanthropic projects that held the power to change lives, I realized he had entrusted me with far more than assets. He had given me the reins to a legacy that could either uplift or destroy, depending on how I chose to wield it. And that weight pressed on me every waking moment, even as my so-called family tried to wrest control from me with tricks, lawsuits, and manipulations. The battles weren't only legal or financial, they became deeply personal. At one point, my own mother broke down in front of me, crying not out of maternal love but because she couldn't believe she hadn't been chosen as the heir. She spat bitter words, accusing me of manipulating my grandfather, of stealing what was rightfully hers. Her anger cut deeper than any lawyer's threat, because it exposed the painful truth. Love and loyalty in this family had always been conditional, and now the billions acted as the ultimate test of character. I could feel eyes watching me wherever I went. The media caught wind of the story, plastering my face across headlines, speculating about why a nobody grandchild was chosen over everyone else. Strangers wrote letters asking for help, scammers sent emails pretending to be in dire need, and suddenly I felt as though the entire world wanted a piece of me. It was overwhelming. Nights were sleepless, filled with the haunting realization that I had not just inherited wealth, but enemies. Yet there were moments of clarity, too. When I walked through the grand halls of my grandfather's mansion, I could still smell his cologne in the library, still see his favorite chair by the fireplace, and I remembered the private conversations we had shared, where he told me stories of his struggles as a young man. He had come from nothing, built everything with grit, intelligence, and vision, and perhaps in me he saw that same spark he once carried. Those memories became my anchor, the reminder that I couldn't let greed, hatred, or fear dictate my next steps. But the deeper I dug into the estate, the more I realized that my inheritance wasn't just wealth, it was a puzzle, a labyrinth of secrets that my grandfather had deliberately left for me to uncover. In one of his private safes, I found letters written decades ago to powerful figures, politicians, CEOs, and philanthropists, all hinting at a network he had cultivated not just to grow his fortune, but to influence the world. Some letters mentioned projects still in motion, hospitals being built under hidden trusts, scholarships for students in countries that had never heard his name, and covert donations to causes that could shift the balance of power in nations. The more I read, the more I realized he had been more than a billionaire. He had been a silent architect of change, someone who moved pieces on the global chessboard without ever taking credit. And now, by handing me this empire, he had passed me the torch, silently asking me if I was ready to carry forward a vision far greater than myself. The idea terrified me. I had once been invisible, the overlooked grandchild at family gatherings, and now I stood at the center of a storm, with the power to either uphold his legacy or let it crumble. And even though the wealth glittered like temptation, I could feel the darker forces circling, people who would do anything to see me fail, because to them, $5 billion wasn't just money. It was power. And power was something they couldn't accept being in the hands of someone they had dismissed as nothing. The pressure mounted until it became unbearable, as though the very air I breathed was tainted with expectation and betrayal. Every time I stepped out of the mansion gates, reporters swarmed, flashing cameras in my face, shouting questions about what I planned to do with the money, whether I would sell the estate, or if I would donate it. Their voices blurred together until they became a single deafening hum, drowning out my own thoughts. Inside the mansion, the walls seemed to whisper with my grandfather's presence, but instead of comfort, they carried the weight of decisions waiting to be made. Boardrooms full of executives eyed me like an amateur intruder, doubting my ability to run the companies I now technically owned. At family gatherings, if they could still be called that, faces once familiar twisted with bitterness, their smiles painted on with venom behind them. I had gone from invisible to being the center of every conversation, but for all the wrong reasons. What they didn't understand, though, was that while they saw only money, I saw my grandfather's trust, and I wasn't going to let anyone snatch that away from me. One night, as I sat alone in the study with the soft glow of the desk lamp illuminating stacks of old files, I came across a small locked journal tucked deep within a drawer. Its cover was worn, the leather cracked with age, but I knew instantly it was important. Inside, written in his strong, deliberate handwriting, were entries that spanned decades, diary-like confessions of struggles, regrets, and dreams. He wrote of the loneliness that wealth had brought him, the friends he lost to envy, and the enemies he gained by daring to succeed. Yet, among the pages of sorrow, there were also seeds of wisdom. Wealth is not measured in dollars, one entry read, but in the number of lives touched for the better. A billionaire who only counts money is poorer than the man who shares his bread. That line echoed in me like scripture. Suddenly, the estate no longer felt like a cage, it felt like a mission. I could almost feel his spirit pushing me forward, urging me not to waste what he had built, but to use it as a tool for change, but reality wasn't as forgiving as his words. Within weeks, lawsuits were filed against me from relatives claiming I was unfit to manage the estate. Some accused me of forging the will, others tried to drag my name through the mud by leaking embarrassing half-truths to the media. Business rivals circled like sharks, betting on my collapse, waiting for me to stumble so they could take pieces of the empire for themselves. There were even moments when I feared for my safety, when strange cars lingered outside the mansion too long, and anonymous letters arrived with threats scribbled in shaky handwriting. And through it all, I stood on the razor's edge of fear and determination. I could have walked away, signed over the estate, and disappeared back into obscurity, but then I remembered the nights I had spent with my grandfather in this very house, when he would pour a glass of scotch and tell me about his youth, about the betrayals he endured, about the resilience that carried him when all odds were against him. He had faced the same demons, and he had chosen to fight. That realization lit a fire in me I didn't know existed. The turning point came when I stopped seeing myself as a victim of the inheritance and began seeing myself as its steward. I started making decisions, not to appease family, not to silence critics, but to honor my grandfather. I took control of board meetings, surprising executives with a knowledge they didn't think I possessed, because I had spent sleepless nights studying his notes and absorbing every detail of his empire. I began redirecting parts of the estate toward projects that mattered, funding education programs, hospitals, and even small businesses that reminded me of his humble beginnings. Slowly, the narrative began to change. The media, once hungry for my downfall, started calling me the unlikely heir who rose to the challenge. And though my family's resentment only deepened, I stopped seeking their approval. I had finally understood that my grandfather hadn't chosen me because of blood or appearances, but because he saw in me the heart to carry forward his dream without letting greed consume me. Yet, even as I embraced this role, I couldn't ignore the dark shadows that still lingered. The estate had enemies, powerful ones, and my decisions were making me targets. The more I gave to others, the more certain factions grew restless, because generosity threatened their grip on power. I realized that my grandfather hadn't just left me wealth, he had left me unfinished battles, enemies disguised as allies, and a legacy that demanded courage beyond anything I had ever known. And though fear lingered in the pit of my stomach, I couldn't back down. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the forgotten grandchild, or the family's afterthought. I was the heir of a vision larger than money, and I was ready to defend it, no matter the cost. The final chapter of this journey began not with wealth, but with a choice, whether to let the billions control me or to rise above them. My grandfather's estate, worth $5 billion, was never meant to be just about numbers. It was a test of character, and the weight of that realization hit me every single day as I walked the marble halls of the mansion or sat across boardroom tables filled with men and women twice my age, their eyes calculating, their voices dripping with doubt. But the more they underestimated me, the stronger I became. I remembered his words from that leather-bound journal, words etched into my heart: power means nothing if it doesn't serve people. With that as my compass, I began to reshape the empire, piece by piece, not for luxury, not for status, but to turn the wealth into something living, breathing, something that would outlast even me. I poured billions into building schools in neglected towns, hospitals in cities where healthcare was once a luxury, and research foundations that brought hope to families fighting illnesses with no cures. I created scholarships for kids who, like me, had once been overlooked, kids who the world never expected to rise. For every board member who scoffed, I showed results. For every critic who sneered, I answered with proof. And with each victory, I felt closer to my grandfather, not the billionaire the world admired, but the man who once sat with me on the porch in silence, teaching me that legacy wasn't about headlines, it was about hearts. The world began to take notice. Reporters who once hounded me for scandals now followed me for success stories, and headlines shifted from the unfit heir to the heir who gave it all back. But success didn't silence the darkness. Family members grew colder, consumed by jealousy. Some refused to speak to me at all, their greed so deep they couldn't see the truth, that the estate could never have been theirs, because they didn't have the strength to shoulder its responsibility. Rivals grew desperate, throwing obstacle after obstacle in my path. Threats continued, more subtle now, from those who thrived in shadows, but each time I stood my ground, I realized that what I had inherited wasn't just wealth, it was resilience. My grandfather had lived his life fighting these same forces, and in my defiance, I honored him more than any monument or statue could. I carried the scars of betrayal, but I wore them like armor, proof that I had survived every storm they threw at me. One evening, after years of battles, I stood in the same study where I had first discovered his journal. The empire was no longer just his, it was ours, forged from his foundation but reshaped by my hands. I opened the window, feeling the night air sweep across my face, and for the first time in a long time, I smiled without the weight of fear. Outside, the world saw me as a billionaire, but inside, I knew I was something more. I was the grandchild who had carried a legacy forward, not by clinging to riches, but by proving that love, honor, and purpose could outweigh every dollar in the bank. And as I placed the worn journal back into the drawer, I whispered softly into the silence of the room, "I hope I made you proud." So when people ask me what it's like to inherit $5 billion, I don't tell them about the jets or the mansions or the endless luxury. I tell them it's like inheriting a torch in the middle of a storm, one you either let burn out in fear, or one you shield with everything you have, so its flame lights the way for others. That's what my grandfather gave me. That's what I chose to carry. And if you've stayed with me through this story, I'll ask you one thing: subscribe, because this isn't just the story of wealth. It's the story of resilience, of standing when the world wants you to fall, and of proving that legacy isn't about what you own, it's about what you leave behind.